So chapter 23 and chapter 24, chapter 23 test has 15 questions, and then chapter 24 has 29. So 44 total points, 44 total multiple choice questions. On your review sheet for chapter 23, the first term there is Ulysses S. Grant. There's two questions here about Grant. At the conclusion of the Civil War, Grant accepted gifts of houses and money from citizens. He was corrupt, at least especially when it came to campaign donations and such. He accepted gifts, and he owed his victory to the votes of former slaves. So there was the earliest elections right after the Civil War, there is some participation. Once the South and Reconstruction really starts to get underway and the black codes have a chance to be used, the former slave participation in elections really goes down. As a result of the Civil War, waste and extravagance, speculation and graft reduced the moral statute of the Republic. So there's waste, there's speculation, there's this thing called graft, a lot of corruption during this post-Civil War time period. In the late 19th century, those political candidates who campaigned by waving the bloody shirt were reminding voters of the treason of the Confederate Democrats during the Civil War. Waving the bloody shirt meant you need to vote for the Republican Northerners and reminding of the treason committed by the Southerners. One weapon that was used to put Boss Tweed in jail were the cartoons by the political satirist Thomas Nast. The Credit Mobular scandal involved kickbacks from the railroad construction companies. Credit Mobular scandal are railroad construction corruption or kickbacks. In an attempt to avoid prosecution in their corrupt dealings, the owners of the Credit Mobular company, they distributed shares of the company's valuable stock to key congressmen. So key congressmen were then owners of this construction company, and then those key congressmen would vote for legislation that would benefit that company that they themselves now own or are partners in. The major problem of the 1876 presidential election centered on the two sets of election returns submitted by Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. So those states, we talked about this, those states submit two different sets of electoral results. One goes for Hayes and the other goes for Tilden. And we talked about how then they have that compromise. Compromise allows Hayes to become president, but then the Republicans give up Reconstruction, they give up the Freedmen's Bureau, they give up all of Lincoln's Reconstruction plan for the South, which then initiates the black codes and a segregated South. This would be Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. So the Compromise of 1877 was the result, and this is the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. And the federal troops were in the South to enforce Reconstruction. So that's abandoning that. The sequence of presidential terms, these forgettable presidents of the Gilded Age, write this down for the order. The forgettable presidents, it goes Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland. I'll say that again. It goes Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, and then Cleveland again. The forgettable presidents of the Gilded Age. 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is constitutional. To have separate but equal facilities, they are constitutional. at the end of Reconstruction, Southern whites disenfranchised African Americans to be disenfranchised means to not be able to vote. So at the end of this Reconstruction, once the federal troops are withdrawn and black codes are in place, the disenfranchisement of African Americans was achieved by literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, the KKK, all kinds of intimidation tactics. There's lots of ways in which disenfranchisement of African Americans occurs. So the legal codes that established this system of segregation were called the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws or black codes. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to be assassinated while in office, and the second president was Garfield. Garfield was assassinated by a deranged and disappointed office seeker, somebody that wanted to get a job and was denied that job. And then this person came after the president. So that's the review for chapter 23. Let's move into chapter 24 then. The first question here about private railroad promoters asked the United States government for subsidies to build their railroads. And they gave the following reasons. It was too risky. This endeavor, building the Transcontinental Railroad, was too risky without government help. It was too costly without government help. The private investors would not take on this kind of endeavor. It's just too much money and too risky, and it would take too long. And it would be impossible for the private industry to build the railroad and help both post office and the military without having the government help. Does that make sense? You're going to use the government's going to use this railroad to transport the military and to transport mail. And so you need the government to also help build it. At least help finance it and make sure to take away some of the risk. During the Gilded Age, most of the railroad barons built the railroads with government assistance. The national government helped to finance transcontinental railroad construction in the late 19th century by providing railroad corporations with land grants. And we talked about the large amounts of land that were given to these railroad companies to help compensate the cost. One byproduct of the development of the railroad was the movement of people to cities. People start to move to cities. The greatest single factor that helped spur the amazing industrialization of the post-Civil War years was the railroad network. The United States changed to standard time zones when the major rail lines decreed common fixed times so that they could keep their schedules and avoid wrecks. Early railroad owners formed pools in order to avoid competition. They would divide business in a particular area, so they would kind of have prearranged monopolies over certain areas, and then they could charge about as much as they wanted. Those were called pools. The first federal regulatory agency designed to protect the public interest from business combinations was the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. The Interstate Commerce Commission, this is set up to help to regulate some of these business combinations, these trusts, these pools, these monopolies. One of the most significant aspects of the ICC was that it represented the first large-scale attempt by the federal government to regulate business. It tries to kind of start to clamp down on some of the corrupt business practices. One of the methods by which post-Civil War business leaders increased their profits was the elimination of as much competition as possible. Get rid of competition, form monopolies, and that's going to increase your profits dramatically. Match the following. We have Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Duke. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Duke. Carnegie was steel. Rockefeller was oil. Morgan was banking. And Duke was tobacco. Those were the industries in which these gentlemen became titans, or they had monopolies. Yeah, one more time. Carnegie was steel, Rockefeller, oil, Morgan, J.P. Morgan, banking, Duke had tobacco, James Duke. The steel industry owed much of its inventive genius to a guy by the name of Henry Bessemer. Henry Bessemer revolutionized the steel industry by coming up with the Bessemer process, which kind of made a higher quality of steel, and it was much more efficient to make it. J.P. Morgan undermined competition by placing officers of his bank on the boards, supposedly independent companies that he wanted to control. This method was known as the interlocking dictatorate. Interlocking dictatorate. America's first billion-dollar corporation was the U.S. Steel. That's Carnegie, U.S. Steel. The first major product of the oil industry. In oil, this was kerosene, so Rockefeller made a lot of money. First and foremost, in kerosene. The oil industry became a huge business when the invention of the internal combustion engine turns gasoline production profitable. Rockefeller used all the following tactics. He employed spies. He extorted rebates from railroads. He pursued a policy of rule or ruin, and he also used high-pressure sales methods. He did not use federal agents to break his competitors, but he did all the rest. He employed spies. Oh, that's Rockefeller. The gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth associated godliness with riches, and it held that the wealthy should display moral responsibility for their God-given money. The reason why they were rich is because they were good, God-fearing Christians. That's the gospel of wealth. The 14th Amendment was especially helpful to giant corporations when defending themselves against regulations by state governments. The 14th Amendment was helpful for giant corporations. They used the 14th Amendment to justify their practices. During the age of industrialism, the South remained overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. So even during these great monopolies and industrialism, the South remained still rural and agricultural. The group most affected by the new industrial age were probably women. Women were most effective because of the opportunity to find jobs. Generally, the Supreme Court in the late 19th century interpreted the Constitution in such a way as to favor corporations. The Supreme Court favored corporations during this time. And in its efforts on behalf of workers, the National Labor Union won an 8-hour workday for government workers. The labor union helped the government workers win an 8-hour workday. One group barred from membership in this labor union movement, especially the Knights of Labor, was the Chinese. The Chinese were not allowed to join this labor union. The most effective and most enduring labor union of the post-Civil War period, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, still exists today. By 1900, organized labor in America had begun to develop a more positive image with the public. Earlier than 1900, labor unions tended to have a bad image, a not so positive image, but by 1900, organized labor in America began to develop a positive image with the public. The people who found fault with the captains of industries or these robber barons mostly argued that these men built their corporate wealth and power by exploiting workers. The exploitation of the American labor force. Even historians critical of the captains of industry and capitalism generally concede that class-based protests have never been a powerful force in the United States, because America has greater social mobility than any other country, especially way more social mobility than Europe had at the time. So any kind of class-based conflict was not received very sympathetically in Europe, because Europe had no social mobility. You were born into a class and you pretty much stayed there. In America, theoretically, anything is possible. All of the following were important factors in the post-Civil War industrial expansion. We had a political climate favorable for business. We had a lot of American ingenuity and inventiveness. In the PowerPoint, we talked about all of these new inventions. An abundance of natural resources and a large pool of unskilled labor. Everybody was looking for a job. And so that then allows for this industrial expansion in post-Civil War America to basically have an awful lot of success. So that pretty much concludes chapter 24 as well.